Out in the back country, nights settle in differently. Routine sounds stretch farther, and small irregularities carry more weight than they should. These are accounts from people who were used to that silence and still found something in it they couldn't explain away. I was 32 that summer, on a temporary assignment out of the Stanislaus National Forest District, covering a small backcountry contact station that sat a few miles off a service road most visitors didn't even know existed. The kind of place with a single solar array, a propane fridge that clicked on and off all night, and a radio that only held a signal if you stood near the west-facing window. And my job was mostly routine, checking permits, updating the trailhead board down the slope, logging weather shifts, and keeping an eye on a section of trail that had been quietly rerouted after a rock slide the previous strain. Nothing complicated, just long stretches of quiet, punctuated by occasional hikers who'd show up dusty and distracted, and grateful to see a person. That particular evening had been uneventful enough that I remember noticing small things, like how the wind had shifted uphill earlier than usual, carrying a dry, almost metallic smell from somewhere deeper in the trees, and how the ravens that usually circled the ridge had disappeared before sunset, leaving the place feeling wider than it actually was. And I had just finished a scheduled radio check, barely caught the ranger on the other end through static, when I stepped outside to secure the storage shed, since we'd had issues with raccoons getting into the feed bins. And I remember pausing on the small wooden porch because the air had gone still, in a way that didn't match the forecast. No breeze, no insect noise, just the faint hum from the inverter box mounted under the eaves. I locked the shed, checked the latch twice out of habit, and as I turned back toward the cabin, I saw a light far down the service road, not headlights exactly, more like a narrow beam sweeping low across the ground, cutting in and out behind the trees. And it didn't make sense, because that road was gated about 3 miles back, and we hadn't issued any vehicle permits that day. So I stood there longer than I should have, watching it move slowly, stop, then move again, like whoever was holding it wasn't sure where they were going. And eventually, it disappeared behind a bend, and the darkness settled back in like it had been waiting. I didn't log it right away, which I regret now. I just went inside, checked the radio again, got nothing but a hiss, and started going through the end-of-day checklist, making sure the generator backup was set, the logbook was updated, that kind of thing. But I kept catching myself listening for an engine that never came, and around maybe 10:30, after I'd shut off the main lights and left just the desk lamp on, I heard something outside that didn't fit the usual pattern of night sounds out there. Not an animal moving through brush, not wind, but a slow, deliberate crunch of gravel, coming from the direction of the path that led up from the road to the cabin. And I froze in place, not out of panic, but because it didn't line up with anything I could explain. And I told myself it could be a late hiker, someone who'd missed the turnoff, though no one hikes that road in the dark unless something's gone wrong. And I waited for a voice or a call or even a cough. But there was nothing, just those measured steps that stopped just short of the porch. I didn't turn on the exterior light right away, which was another mistake. I just stood there in the dim room, letting my eyes adjust, trying to see movement through the front window, but the angle worked against me. And after maybe 20 seconds that felt longer, I heard the soft rattle of the metal latch on the storage shed off to the side, the same one I had just secured. And it moved once, then again, like someone testing it gently, not forcing it, just checking. And that's when I reached for the radio. Even though I knew reception would be poor, I keyed it anyway, called in, got static, tried again, nothing. And while I was doing that, the sound outside stopped completely. Not footsteps retreating, not a door opening, just absence. And that silence pressed in hard enough that I finally flipped on the porch light. The beam cut across the clearing, lit up the shed, the path, the edge of the trees, and there was no one there, no movement, no sign of anyone having just been standing within a few feet of the cabin. But what I did see And what I didn't understand in the moment was that the dust on the path, fine, dry, untouched since late afternoon, had a single set of prints leading up from the road, stopping about 5 feet short of the porch, and then nothing returning the way they came. And I remember stepping out slowly, scanning the tree line, calling out once, just a plain hey, not expecting an answer, and getting none. And I checked the shed. The latch was still engaged, but there was a faint smear on the metal, like someone had run their fingers along it. And I stood there longer than I should have, listening, trying to convince myself there was a reasonable explanation I was missing, before going back inside and locking the door, this time sliding the secondary bolt we almost never used. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept the lamp on, kept the radio within reach, and at some point after midnight, I thought I heard the same gravel shift again, but farther out, like whoever it had been was moving away slowly. And by the time morning came and the light flattened everything back into something normal, I went out to check the path again, expecting to see what I'd seen the night before more clearly. But the prints were different. There were more of them now, overlapping slightly, like someone had come and gone multiple times while I was inside. And what stayed with me wasn't just that. It was what I found in the logbook when I went to write it all down, because on the previous page, dated 2 days before I arrived, there was a note in handwriting that wasn't mine and didn't match the ranger I'd relieved. Just one line tucked between weather entries that read, "He checks the latch at night." And I had no idea who had written it, or how long that had been true. I was 45 when I took a seasonal logistics contract out in the high desert section of Grand Staircase, Escalante National Monument. Not as a ranger, but as a support tech responsible for maintaining a cluster of remote trail contact points and radio relays. And for a few weeks that fall, I was stationed at a low concrete outpost near an unmarked junction where two seldom used backcountry routes crossed. The kind of place with a rusted shade awning, a locked equipment cage, and a radio mast that hummed faintly when the wind hit it right. And I wasn't supposed to have much company out there beyond the occasional overlander or permitted research group. But the first odd thing wasn't a person. It was a permit stub pinned to the board outside that didn't match the system logs. Wrong color paper, outdated format, and a group size that exceeded what we allowed in that sector. And I remember standing there with it in my hand, turning it over, noticing how the ink had bled slightly into the fibers like it had been printed on a cheap home machine, not our standard stock. And I told myself it was probably someone who copied an old template, not uncommon with people trying to avoid fees. So I logged it and moved on. But that same afternoon, while I was checking the backup batteries in the equipment cage, I saw a vehicle parked far beyond where anyone should reasonably drive, tucked behind a rise of pale rock about half a mile out. Not moving, no dust plume, just sitting there angled in a way that suggested whoever parked it didn't want it visible from the main track. I watched it through binoculars for a minute. Couldn't make out a plate, just the shape, older model, light-colored, and I remember thinking I'd deal with it after finishing the battery check. But by the time I came back out, it was gone, without any sign of departure. No fresh track cutting across the hardpan that I could see from where I stood. And the quiet returned so completely, it felt staged, like a set after actors had cleared. That night the temperature dropped fast, as it does out there, and I sealed up the station, ran a short radio check. Signal was patchy, which wasn't unusual with the inversion layer settling in, and started writing up the day's notes when I heard a knock. Not loud, just 2 firm taps against the metal door, spaced evenly, and it didn't come with a voice or a call-out, which is what people usually do out there. They announce themselves first. So I waited, thinking maybe I'd imagined it, but then it came again, same rhythm, and I opened the small sliding panel built into the door, instead of unlocking it, just enough to look through. And there was a man standing a few feet back, maybe late 30s, hard to tell in the low light, wearing a dark jacket that didn't look like hiking gear, more like something you'd wear in town. And he asked, plain and steady, if this was the station issuing overnight permits for the canyon route. And there was nothing overtly wrong with the question except that no one should have been asking it there at that hour, and definitely not without already having gone through the main office miles back. So I told him we didn't issue permits on site after dark and asked where he'd come from, and he paused a second too long before saying he'd driven in late and couldn't find the main road again, which didn't line up with the terrain or the signage, sparse as it was. And while we were talking, I noticed his eyes weren't adjusting to me or the light. They kept flicking past my shoulder into the interior of the station, taking in the layout, the radio, the map board, and that made me shift slightly so he couldn't see as much. I offered him directions back to the junction, simple, clear, but he didn't move to leave, just stood there and asked if anyone else was stationed with me, casual tone, like it was a routine question, and I said no without elaborating, which I realized right after was probably the wrong answer to give someone I didn't trust. And he nodded once, said all right, and stepped back into the dark beyond the small cone of light from the doorway, and I closed the panel, locked it, and stood there listening, expecting to hear an engine start, gravel shift, something. But there was nothing for a long stretch, and then, faintly, off to the side of the building where the equipment cage was, I heard a metallic click, like the gate latch being tested. I grabbed my handheld light, went to the back window instead of the door this time, and angled it out just enough to sweep the cage, and for a second I caught movement, just the edge of a sleeve or an arm withdrawing behind the concrete corner. And then it was gone, and I called out louder now, told whoever was out there to leave the equipment alone, that it was monitored, which wasn't entirely true, but sometimes the suggestion is enough. And after that there was silence again, deeper than before, and eventually, after maybe 10 minutes, I heard the distant start of an engine. Not close, not even on the visible track, more like it was coming from somewhere beyond the ridge, where there shouldn't have been a passable route. I didn't sleep much that night either. I kept the radio on, tried a few times to raise the main office but only got fragments back. And in the morning, I went out to check the cage and the surrounding ground. And the latch had a fresh scrape across it, metal exposed where the paint had been worn down, and there were tracks. But not just one set. Multiple overlapping tire marks leading in from different angles, some older, some fresh, crossing over each other in a way that suggested repeated visits, not just a single vehicle passing through. And near the edge of that cluster, half buried in dust, was another permit stub. Same wrong paper, same format as the one from the board, except this one had a different date and a different group size, both handwritten instead of printed. And what unsettled me later, after I'd reported it, and someone higher up had come out to take a look, was how quickly it was all written off as unauthorized recreational use. Nothing coordinated, nothing deliberate, just people cutting corners. Because when I went back inside to update the log, I noticed the small grease pencil mark I'd left on the inside of the door frame the night before. Just a habit to track whether the door had been opened while I was asleep, and it had been smeared downward, as if someone had tested the handle from the outside after I had already secured it, and I hadn't heard that part at all. I was 27 and in my second year with the Forest Service when I took a late-season assignment at a fire lookout support cabin on the northern edge of Flathead National Forest, a spot that sat below the actual lookout tower and functioned as a supply and relay point once the main crew rotated out. And by October, it was usually just one person at a time keeping the place operational, checking the generator shed, logging weather, maintaining the radio link for any crews still moving equipment out before snow. And I wasn't supposed to have visitors at all that late in the season. The access road was technically closed with a locked gate about 6 miles down, but closures don't stop everyone, and part of the job was just documenting what you saw and keeping things from getting worse. The first thing that didn't sit right wasn't even at night. It was mid-afternoon while I was updating the old corkboard inside the cabin with the final fire restrictions notice, and I noticed a thumbtack already in place where I hadn't put one, pushed in at an angle like someone had used it recently. And I remember pulling it out and turning it between my fingers because it had a slight bend in the metal point, fresh enough that it hadn't rusted over. And I told myself it was probably from the last crew and I just missed it during check-in, which happens more than you'd think. But later, When I went out to the generator shed to run the evening test cycle, I found the fuel cap not fully tightened, just a quarter turn loose, and I knew I'd secured it the night before because I had a habit of tapping it twice with the wrench before closing up. So I tightened it again, slower this time, and stood there a moment longer than necessary, listening to the engine idle, watching the tree line beyond the clearing where the undergrowth thinned out into a shallow slope. There wasn't anything obvious, no movement, but the birds had gone quiet in a way that didn't match the hour, and I had that steady practical thought in my head that something had been there recently, not necessarily dangerous, just present, and that was enough to make me run through a quicker version of my end-of-day routine. Check the windows, secure the storage lockers, bring the handheld radio inside early, and by the time the light started dropping behind the ridge, the temperature followed it down fast. The kind of cold that settles into the wood and makes the cabin creak in small, sharp sounds. I ate at the small table by the window, kept the overhead light off to preserve my night vision. And around maybe 8:15, while I was rinsing out a metal cup in the sink, I heard a vehicle where there shouldn't have been one. Not close, but distinct enough. An engine idling low, then cutting out abruptly. And I set the cup down without finishing, went to the window, and killed the interior lamp entirely so I could see out better. And through the trees, I caught a faint reflection that could have been from a windshield or a piece of metal catching the last light, positioned lower than the road should have allowed, like it was off to the side in the brush. I waited for a door slam, voices, anything, but it stayed quiet. And after a while I told myself it might be someone turning around at the gate. Sound carrying up the slope, but it didn't feel right, because the timing was off, and the direction didn't match. And I ended up locking the main door earlier than usual, and bringing the old log book over to the table just to have something structured to focus on. Flipping through previous entries from that season, looking at weather notes, small remarks from other rangers, and I noticed a pattern I hadn't paid attention to before. 3 separate entries over the past month, each from a different person, each mentioning unconfirmed vehicle noise after closure hours with no follow-up. No incident report attached, just that same phrase written slightly differently each time, like it had been copied from memory instead of policy. Around 10, the radio crackled once, not a full transmission, just a burst of static that cut through the room sharply enough to make me look up, and I stepped over, adjusted the dial, tried to raise the main station, got nothing back but a low hiss, and as I was turning away, I heard something outside that wasn't mechanical at all. A slow step on the wooden porch, one board giving slightly underweight, then settling, and I stayed where I was, not moving toward the door this time, just listening, counting the seconds, and there was another step, closer to the door frame, followed by a light, almost absent-minded knock, once, then a pause, then twice more. Uneven, like whoever was there wasn't following any kind of pattern. I didn't answer, didn't speak, just watched the handle from across the room, and after a moment, it shifted slightly. Not fully turning, just enough to test resistance, and I was aware of how thin that door actually was. How the lock was more about signaling than stopping anyone determined, and I reached for the handheld radio again, keyed it quietly, said my location and that I might have unauthorized presence at the cabin. And the response that came back was broken, just fragments of my own call echoing back delayed, which happens sometimes with the terrain, but hearing your own voice come back like that when you're already keyed up does something to your head. Outside, the porch creaked again, this time moving away from the door, one step, then another, and I finally moved toward the side window, keeping low, and eased the curtain back just enough to look out. But the angle only gave me a slice of the porch and the first line of trees beyond, and there was no one visible, no shadow moving, nothing, and I stayed there long enough that my eyes started to invent motion where there wasn't any, so I pulled back and waited. And after a while the forest noise returned in pieces, the wind in the upper branches first, then a distant owl. And I told myself, whoever it was had left. I didn't sleep. I sat at the table with the logbook open, writing down what I could remember in as natural a tone as possible. because that's what we're trained to do. Keep it factual, avoid speculation. And at some point near dawn, I must have dozed off for a few minutes, because I woke up to the sound of the generator clicking as it cycled off, and the gray light coming through the window had that flat, early morning look that makes everything seem less threatening than it was a few hours earlier. And I went outside to check the porch, the immediate area, expecting to see tracks in the thin layer of frost that had settled overnight. But the boards were clean. No visible prints, no disturbance. And the ground beyond was too hard in places to hold detail, except near the edge of the clearing where the soil stayed softer. And there I found a set of tire tracks that hadn't been there a day before, cutting in from the direction of the closed road, but stopping short of the cabin, turning slightly as if the driver had angled the vehicle to keep the structure in view without pulling fully into the open. I followed them a short distance until they merged with older tracks and became indistinct. And when I came back to the cabin, something small had changed that I couldn't immediately place. Just a sense that the interior wasn't arranged exactly how I'd left it. And it took me a minute to realize it was the corkboard. The notice I'd pinned the day before had been adjusted, not removed, just shifted slightly so it sat straighter. And the bent thumbtack I'd taken out earlier was back in place at the top corner, pressed in firmly this time, holding the paper flat. And I knew I hadn't put it the